I'm honored to be here and to talk about this whole thing of parenting. We're going to call this 10 Gifts That Last a Lifetime. And let me just give you a little bit of a background on some things. There'll be some scriptures that we use. Pretty much everything's scripturally based, but this will be much more Proverbs than it will like Romans, if you will. And I just want to talk like real life things I've seen, I've learned, a few things we did right along the way. And I want to give you a little bit of a context to where I come from at family. And it's kind of fun for me at this point in life as well, because my oldest son is 40, and then we have a daughter in between, and the youngest son is 35. So now we're at this zone where you get to see, did it really work? You know, because you're always kind of showing or talking about these things all along. But just a little background to kind of explain, if you will, my worldview, because that impacts it. So some of you heard me say before that I feel often like I started life at third base because I have absolutely zero father wound. My dad is 96 years old. My mom is 93 years old. They're still deeply in love with each other. One of my favorite pictures is from about a year and a half ago. They're walking towards the San Clemente Pier, hand in hand, as they're just walking there. And so that special gift they gave us. They grew up, Chris Brown and I both often talk about the legalistic backgrounds we had in church. You know, more rules than Jesus could have ever thought of, but the weird thing is they followed those rules because that was all they knew, but they weren't legalistic in their heart. Does that make sense to you? And they weren't cynical like of other people. So I had like a jacked up church I grew up in, to say the very least, and that's kind of all mom and dad knew, but they never let it jack up their heart and their spirit towards other people, especially with that pride and arrogance that can come with all of that. And then there's one other piece, and that is they both pretty much came from cesspools. And if one of you want to catch me on a break or later on, I'll show you. One of my favorite pictures is about 4 years ago, Christmas. They were still always hosting it until just a few years ago, 40 or 45 of us in the family. So they've got their kids, they've got the spouses, they've got 18 or 19 great-grandchildren, plus their grandchildren. I mean, this just wonderful, life-giving spring where by the grace of God, everybody's walking with Jesus, but one of my nephews who would say that he's following Jesus, but let's just say he's not following him hard. Okay, but he's not all messed up. I mean, that's just amazing when you come from kind of that mess. And so I just learned so much of what I learned about parenting just by the home I grew up in. And things that as I got older, I watched. And you know how it is. When you get married, you suddenly realize somebody has a whole bunch of really weird Christmas and holiday traditions. I mean, because like yours were the right ones, right? Like, what's up with this? And we do that with parenting as well. I just thought it's done like this, and I had no idea the incredible lessons that they were giving. And another fun thing, I'm going to have some fun in just a moment showing you something, but another fun thing is this has been a hobby horse of mine probably since my kids were 5, 6, 7 years old. And I had the privilege of working with a lot of pastors and mentoring them that are in vocational ministry. And I kept pounding and pounding into them. The only thing that really matters is your wife, is your kids, and everything else you're just an interim in. And what's interesting to me is this same talk was pretty much the same thing 25, 30 years ago. Because the principles work, they come out of Scripture. Now, they don't guarantee everything's going to go right, and we're going to talk about that. But I want to put up right now just a little look at the changing sermon titles on parenting. When I came to North Coast Church, a little group of 70 meet in the Carlsbad High School cafeteria, and my first sermon on parenting, let's go ahead and pop that slide up, if you got it. I was 28 years old. Nance was 24. We had no kids, so the title of the sermon was something like this: 10 Rules for Raising Godly Kids. Then, a few years later, pop up the next one. I'm 31 with a strong-willed 2-year-old. Some of you know my oldest son, okay? You Google strong-willed, you go to images, there he is, the whole first page, okay? It was now 7 principles for raising good kids. Then a few years later, it was after our second child, I think the title of the sermon was 5 Guidelines for Raising Kids. And after we had all 3, it was this. Here we go. 3 suggestions for surviving parenthood. Some of you have been there? Okay. So I realize it's an easy thing to talk about, not always so easy to control. But the first thing before we go into what are the 10 gifts, what I call the 10 gifts that will last a lifetime you can give your kids, is I want to take a moment and I want to blow up, because sometimes you got to blast before you build. I want to blow up one of the most devastating Christian parenting myths that has ever been out there. And it is simply this, that a godly home guarantees godly kids. A godly home guarantees godly kids. I grew up with that, a totally misuse of Proverbs. You know, if you raise, old King James, I say, raise up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Some of you have heard that one. And then parents are just, I'm just holding on to that. God's going to bring him back. And that's not what the verse says. It says, bring them up in the way they should go, the way they are bent, which would include the nurture and admonition of the Lord, but bring them up that way. And then it says, when they are old, the Hebrew is for bearded, when they hit adulthood, young adulthood, they will not depart from it. It doesn't say they're guaranteed to come back. And because of that verse, which is in Proverbs, and Proverbs are what? Proverbs. They're not promises. They're statements about how life generally works. That's the definition of a proverb. The book of Proverbs begins with, these are the proverbs, the pithy statements about how life normally works of Solomon. And so that is how life normally works. But the problem then is, if you end up with kids that are where you want them to be and who you wanted them to be, you start patting yourself on the back like you did it all. And if you have wild child, then you start beating yourself up. And the worst is, you've got kids that are quiet and compliant, they've got wild child, and now you're judging them and becoming arrogant and prideful, so now you got a double whammy that's a part of you. I want to remind you that in the book of Genesis, there was no sin nature. There was perfect environment. And if you want to call God the Father of Adam and Eve, or however you want to call it, perfect parenting. And what did you have? You had rebellion, right? It ignores Ezekiel, both chapter 18 and 21, where the Lord says, I hate this proverb you guys keep saying. What is the proverb? Well, when the fathers eat sour grapes, the children's teeth are turned on edge. Oh, sir, I hate that. Each one is going to stand before me based on what they chose to do and how they did things. They started unrighteous, become righteous, they will be taken care of. They start out righteous and become unrighteous, they will be taken care of. None of us can ever blame our parents, or, we grow up, some of us, in incredibly dysfunctional things. But for every one of us who want to blame the environment, the bad parenting, whatever it would be, there's someone else who came out of that without all the jacked up stuff we have. It's our stuff. So as parents, all you can actually do is do your best. That's all you can do, because you have incredible, incredible influence, okay? But you do not have control. And here's what happens. If you don't understand that what you have is hugely significant influence, if things aren't going the way you want, you start trying to have more and more control, to the point you break a spirit. Some of you maybe grew up in that kind of fear-based sort of home where the slightest little independent thinking or whatever it be, everything's going to be going sideways. So it is an absolutely devastating myth. We are to prepare the horse for battle, and the rest belongs to God. Really, in every part of our life. You can be Abraham, and you can be Job. And when you're Job, it's not because you weren't smart enough to follow the Lord and be Abraham and blessed. No, you read the book of Job, he was God's main man, right? The enemy's meeting with the Lord. Someday I want to figure out how that happens. And the Lord says, hey, have you seen Job? He's my main guy. He's the best of the best. And Satan goes, well, that's because you've blessed him so much. Let's see what happens if you don't. I know I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to know the answer to everything, but I go, I don't get that. So if I'm Job, I'm standing before God going, what was that? You know? And he says, well, I was using you as an object lesson. You know, it's like, I'd rather not have a book in the Bible than have to go through all that stuff. So these are not, this is a secret why our kids came out really well. This is the path that we did that made it easier. But at the end of the day, it's really up to them and how they respond. Now, there's one other thing I want to talk about before we get into 10, and that is why your parenting legacy is the most important legacy you will ever have. You know, we live in a day and age where Karens and okay boomers talk about millennials as like, oh man, their work ethic. They all want a world-changing job. They think they're so self-important. And every time I hear one of my boomer buddies say that, I go, excuse me, have you not ever met a boomer? Because what do they all talk about right now? Their legacy. I go, that's just the flip side of the coin that I want a world-changing life and job and career, and then on the backside, I want a legacy. And I always tell them, I go, I'm sorry, you ain't got no legacy. Scripture is absolutely right. You are here today, gone tomorrow. Pfft, like a mist, like a spray. How many of you went to a college where there were names of people on the buildings? Right? Did any of you really walk in and go, I think I want to do a little research on the guy who donated the money for Metzger Hall? Anybody? Like, no, it was a Metzger Hall. It could have been building CD. I was like, whatever. And yet people think, and they will chase the wrong legacy. How many of you know the name of your great-great-grandparents? Raise your hand in the room, seriously. 1, 2, be proud. I'm not going to call on you if you're an introvert. Okay, 1, 2, 3. You're sure you know the name. Okay. 3 people in this room know the name of their great-great-grandparents. Why in the world would you sell the legacy that matters and lasts, your spouse and your kids? Why would you sell that legacy for something at work, something in your profession, something, you name all the other stuff? It's like literally your great-great-grandkids won't know you. The only legacy you have is a spouse and kids and strong fingerprints, frankly, on grandkids. Once in a while, I got a guy I do some mentoring with who was raised by his grandpa, so his grandpa was very strong. But other than that, I remember my grandparents, but it's like, oh yeah, we used to have some cool Christmases there, or whatever it would be. So if only one thing's last, why in the world would I spend all of my focus on these other things when they're all bubbles? They're going to disappear. Personally, this is just by way of example. My legacy as a pastor, I had a legacy in vocational ministry because I had heard, actually I had a friend in that jacked up church I grew up with, was a pastor's kid, and he was jacked up. So I kind of had heard stories about jacked up pastor's kids, and Nancy and I really didn't want that. So I had a legacy dream as a pastor and a legacy dream as a Jesus follower. And I'm just getting, you got to figure out yours, but this will show the window. My legacy one that I dreamed of, and Nancy and I dreamed of for our kids, was number 1, they'd love God. Number 2, they would love the local church. And I say local church, not North Coast Church, because it's very rare someone stays the same time. God did some great things at North Coast Church, but we didn't want them to think, well, that's the only great church around. We also didn't want them to hear the poison of the inside, well, Jesus is good, but church sucks, that kind of thing. So I want them to love the local church. And the third thing was to think Dad being a pastor was the greatest job in the world. That Dad being a pastor was, what did that mean? I had keys to the kitchen. My kids wanted ice cream, they got an ice cream. My kids wanted to go somewhere, whatever it would be. There were certain opportunities where we got to do stuff because of our role, far more than who we were. I always wanted my kids to know the only reason we're eating at this restaurant, the only reason we're at this trip, the only reason we got this or that was because your dad's a vocational pastor. Because the last thing I wanted was when I look around and they felt like they were always second. It was always their birthday party that I was walking out for someone else's emergency. You know, that phone call like, oh, my wife or husband just walked out on me and, you got to come right now. And in reality, that thing had been building up for 5 years, right? But too many of us set those things aside. Quickly for me, just as a Jesus follower, my goal in life is if I die first, which isn't my goal, but whatever. I want Nancy to say I was well loved, which is very different than I was loved, right? Very different. I was well loved, not love you, babe, or well, I knew we always, whatever, well loved. I wanted my kids to say that he's a good man. By the way, not godly, because I've been around godly people who are flat out weird, right? They love God so much, everybody kind of admires that, but they go, you are totally weird. I want him to say he was a good man. I wanted my friends to say he lived his theology. The things he stood up and taught are actually things he did. And if all that happens, it doesn't really matter how big North Coast Church got. It doesn't matter how many books were written. All of those things are bubbles that just totally disappear, but they stay. Does that make sense to you? So I really wanted to, like I said, blast out some of the goofy thinking, like we control it, give you a little sense of a foundation. So now, you ready? 10 gifts that will last a lifetime. The first one is this, and some of these you have been taught, you had parents that did or you're already doing, and some will be a little bit of a surprise. But the first one is choose the right finish line. Choose the right finish line as a parent. The finish line in this culture, in this day and age, is a 30-year-old. The finish line is not your kid winning the spelling bee. The finish line is not your kid making all-stars, most valuable player, and we went all the way to regionals. The finish line is not they were valedictorian of their high school or they were the star player of this. The finish line is not the college they get into. And what I find is a lot of us, based just kind of how our culture goes, we think the finish line is when they're a little bit out on their own. And if you think the finish line is somewhere between 18 and 21 years old, you're going to make very different decisions than if you think the finish line is 30. Very different decisions. I jotted down like a couple of them in our experience. Well, let me just ask you. At 30 years old and plus, did anybody ever ask you what your GPA was? Just curious. Nobody. Did anybody ask you where you graduated in the class ranking at your school? Has anybody come up and asked you whether you played small college, D1, some sport? I mean, all of this stuff we angst over and we spend this money and time and like at 30, nobody cares at all. It changes everything. My youngest son was the best athlete of my 3 kids. Nowhere near as good as I was. Far better than I was. But he had a chance. He played basketball and he ran both distance and what's called the 800. That's a half-mile sprint. Only idiots run that. That's the dumbest race ever. But he ran it. And his senior year, he had a chance to, if he did well enough in the regionals, which he totally was qualified with his times to do, he would then get to go to the state, which would be a pretty big deal in California, right? And he came to me about, 2-3 weeks before, and he said, Dad, I want to go to the prom with my girlfriend, and it's the night before the regionals. I go, what? I want to go to the prom with my girl. It's the night before the regionals. Well, Josh, if you do that, you're going to bonk in the race. I mean, this is one of the hardest races. Half-mile sprint, are you kidding me? Somewhere around the 400-meter mark, you're just going to, Dad, I won't eat too much and I won't stay out, but I really want to. And I said, because I'm raising a 30-year-old, okay. Now, he ran that race. And at the 400-meter mark, he had to come in, I think, first 2 out of the 8 in that, which, again, he could have. I think he came in 7th or 8th. He just tied up, and they have a big fence to keep spectators away, and he comes over, all drenched in sweat. And I looked at him, I said, Josh, you good with your decision? He says, yeah. And I said, I am too. But here's what I want you to catch. If you don't realize you're raising a 30-year-old, you're going to say, this is your last opportunity. This is your senior year. You'll never get, and the famous words, you will understand someday, right? You will thank me someday. And so we end up trying to help our kids be all they can be rather than all they want to be, which is a radically different thing. Oh, by the way, he's married to that girl. Time after time, we do that. The 30-year-old, my oldest son was academically really good, but if you Google lazy butt, you will see his picture. I was sure he was never going to get a job. He's academically, incredibly bright. So he could come home at 11, goof around, read, and all this stuff late at night. And then 11:30 or 12, he'd throw a paper together, and he could get an A on it. But every now and then he'd get a B or whatever. And it's like, well, you could, in this really large school, you could have been pushing for valedictorian or whatever. Instead, you're down a little bit from that. You're going to miss some opportunities here. Your work ethic totally stinks, right? And then I remember he was about 30, and he had his first job where it was an important job, and his boss comes up to me and says, your son has the best work ethic of any young man I've ever worked with. And I said, excuse me, I think you got the wrong redhead. Mine is, okay. But how many of you had that experience in your life? Right? You didn't care about certain things or whatever. So I'm not saying we want to push our kids along. I'm not saying we want to let them miss every opportunity. I did my best to say, hey, you might want to do this, but when you suddenly make 30 years old your gold line, you're not going to spend money you don't have to get them in college they can't afford to pay the debt off of. If any of you have athletic kids, you know that you'll sit in the stands and they're all bragging not only about their kid athletically, but what their grades are and what school they got into and all of this stuff. And by the time they graduate, no one knows if they did their first 2 years in a junior college or their first 7 years in a junior college. All they know is the job they have now. Does this make sense? Massively, massively significant is making sure that we have the right thing. I jotted these down. I want to read them to you. Because here's part of the problem, too, when your kids are really young. The traits that drive us crazy in a child are often the traits we most value when they're 30. The stubbornness of a 3-year-old that drives you crazy is the backbone and conviction of a 33-year-old leader. The acclaimed out-of-the-box thinking entrepreneur was likely a kindergartner who refused to sit in the right chair or color in the lines. The class clown sometimes becomes the perpetual goof-off, but he or she can also become the life of the party and the leader everyone wants to be around. As for the can't sit still for 30 seconds 7-year-old, some of you have that? Okay. Well, they fit the early profile of a high-powered multitasking executive who just hired your compliant kid to be his office manager. I used to always laugh, and again, so much of it was my dad and some mentors I had telling me early on. I don't think I would have figured this out on my own, but how people go, your kids are so good, and what they meant was basically your kids are unnoticed. They're just compliant. They just stay out. And again, is that really what you want? The most compliant 30-year-old? Or are you going to take that risk? Number 2, pursue your calling and your kids' calling instead of your potential. Not only have the right finish line, have the right North Star that you're aiming at. And the thing we're aiming at is to help people and to help ourselves fulfill God's calling in our life, which is not to fulfill all of our potential. Excuse me. We live in a day and age where potential is the God we bow the knee to, and the God we pursue potential's favor all the time. That's just our culture. The worst life lived. Would you agree with me? The worst life lived is a life that didn't reach its potential. Since I played a little bit of basketball, I always think of the first round NBA draft choice who never became anything but, 4 or 5, 6-year journeyman, and that was it. If you're a sports fan, the Comey Browns of whatever drafted by, oh, what a tragedy that was. I mean, first or second pick, and it's like, excuse me, that dude lived every little basketball playing boy's dream. Or if it's in the WA girl's dream. But because potential was put on, suddenly like you're a loser. It's crazy. And it's all the worse because of a parable. If you've been a Jesus follower very long, you've probably heard. It's called the parable of the talents. Have you heard that one? And it talks about, the Lord gave X talents to this guy and he multiplied it. Oh, good job. Here's more. Multiply it. And one took the talents, and so he wouldn't lose it, just buried it. And when the master comes back, he calls him a wicked servant. I'm going to take what you have and give it to the others. And I grew up thinking, man, I better maximize every gift and skill and talent God has given me. But here's the problem. That's not about your skills, gifts, and talents. A talent was an amount of money in the Roman Empire. And it's just a quirk that when it's translated from the Greek to the English, it says they were given X talents, and you and I think of X skills. There's another parable that talks about money, and the word mina is used, and none of us ever do that. We know it's about money. Every other language group looks at that parable and thinks of it as, what did you do with your possessions that God entrusted you with? And we think, what did we do with our skills? All the way sometimes so that we will neglect our calling, our responsibilities, because, you've all heard that story. I've just got this burning desire in me to fill in the blank. It's a God-given thing. I got to pursue it. It's a lie straight out of the pit. The only person who will totally fulfill their potential before God is a single person. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul says, if at all possible, stay single, especially in light of some persecution and stuff that was going on. And then he said, because then you'll be able to be devoted fully to the Lord. But if you're going to burn, go ahead and get married. But you'll have a divided mind. And then to make sure we understand that divided mind is not wrong, he says, and you haven't sinned. You've got a new calling. So, I come to Jesus. I'm on fire. I want to do everything I can in my life for Jesus and leave a mark for the kingdom. And then I realized I was going to burn, so I got married. And then Nancy and I had a kid, and there was one more chip away at my full potential. Then we had another kid, another chip. Then we had a mistake by the lake, which he knows. If you're a feeler, don't feel bad. He thinks it's funny. But now I had 3 kids and a wife that meant all of them were vying for my time, my attention, my priorities, and were robbing me of certain things I was gifted to do, I could do well, but they weren't my calling. Does this make sense to you? This is huge. Because we live in this culture that we all think we're in a documentary movie and it's about us and everybody else is an extra. And we live in this world where, well, I got a gift, I got a skill, I got to use it. This is description, not prescription. I don't put this on anybody else. You got to figure your own way to doing it. But some of you know, I have a gift to write. I've written 10 books. They've sold pretty well. I've got people trying to get me to write another one. I probably won't. I don't like writing. I like having written. But it's a talent. It's a skill I have. And it impacts the kingdom. especially lots of pastors. But when I was writing my third book, so I had two in the can, I'm doing the third one, my 7-year-oldest son says to Nancy, I don't like it when Dad writes, he doesn't play with me. And that was pure baloney. It was about 2 weeks of intense focus and the rest of it different. But in his little world, Dad doesn't play with me. That night, Nancy and I decided I am not going to write another book until every kid is in college. So depending on how you want to count it, 13 to 15 years, I went completely off the grid. No books, not being asked to speak at a conference, no influence, all that just gone. Because I was trying to be a pretty good pastor and a great dad and a great husband. Because that's my calling. And we need to understand that doesn't mean God's going to give you back everything you let go of, because he's not going to restore what the locust ate, because the locust didn't eat him. My obedience ate them. And I would be 15 years younger than I am now with everything I've done, kingdom-wise, influence-wise, other churches, books, all that stuff. I'd have that much more runway. But I probably wouldn't have 3 kids that love Jesus, love their mom and dad, and like each other. And just everywhere, in the business world, in the arts, athletics, and vocational ministry are the 4 areas I see this being the strongest. I've got to maximize their potential. Club programs. Like, we travel around like crazy to make sure our kid is maximizing their absolute potential. I mean, I look at it, sometimes I go, you know, he or she hit like a home run in the T-ball game. It took 3 errors to get all the way around bases, but we're going to call it home run. And dad or mom suddenly goes, they might get a D1 scholarship. So they end up spending more time, energy, and money than it would have been to pay for the college to drive all around. And here's why, and again, I'm not painting club programs with a broad brush. You have to decide. I'm just challenging you apart to think about it, okay? I'm not here to judge someone because in their unique situation, here's why it's good. I want to be crystal clear on that, okay? But like with my one kid that was a really good athlete, I knew it wasn't going to play in the NBA or run in the Olympics. So at that point, you know, some weekends at home was probably a better thing. At that point, a little bit more money for us to be able to do things and, you know, putting stuff on a credit card that we couldn't really afford. And the system works this way. The people who run these programs tell you your kid needs to be in it or they won't be able to make the varsity volleyball team. And they make a ton of money doing it. And so they're talking to vulnerable parents who want the very best for their kids in a culture where we think, if I haven't maximized the potential of my kids, and it's this vicious cycle. Even worse, think about this. And again, you don't have to apologize to me if God's leading for you is different in this situation, your unique stuff. I just want you to think about this. It started probably almost 20 years ago. I'd have parents in my office in tears because their kid went away to college and totally disengaged from fellow believers. Totally disengaged. And I go, I just don't understand it. And I never said this out loud. Just like some of the things I'm saying right now, I won't say from the stage to everybody. You signed up for a course on parenting. You're going to get it. Okay. But, you know, it's not speaking the truth. It's influencing people, right? But what I always wanted to say is you trained them. You absolutely trained them. You trained them that church is a very important thing unless there's a championship. And now they follow your values but not your boundaries, like I talk about a lot. And they have learned that church and Christian fellowship and a Bible study and all that is a very important thing unless, and it's not a championship game, now it's hanging with their friends, it's getting some sleep, it's working a little more on that paper. They're doing exactly what we trained them. And we've got a whole generation of Christian kids who, because mom and dad bowed the knee to potential, wanted them to be as good as they could be when no one's going to, you know, no one, they don't even give out Letterman jackets anymore. Like, no one knows or cares, you know? I still haven't been asked how many points I averaged, which I'm quite glad because it was quite low. But calling and potential. It's very, very important that in your own life you don't get sucked into all you could do is all you should do. And with your kids, all they could do is all they should do. Let's look at number 3. Number 3 is the gift of celebrating character over performance. The gift of celebrating character over performance. And we just don't live in that culture, do we? I did not notice it at the time, but it so shaped my view of God and my walk with God. The way my dad had an interest in our world. I'll talk about that a little bit more later with my brother. But one thing Dad would do is here's some examples of these principles. Again, description, not prescription. But Dad had a chance to apply for a superintendent of school job and decided not to do that because of where it would move us and all the nights out. Then I found out later he was a principal, elementary principal. Why were you in elementary instead of high school? And again, nothing wrong with being a high school principal. His point was, at that point, there were all these nights out. I make just a tad less money and a lot less prestige, and I'm there for you guys. Huh. And my dad was pretty much at every game I ever played. And what I realized later is he'd never take me out after a bad game and show me all the stuff I should have done. You know, some of you T-ball, you want to take your kid out, right? And which is great when they want to do it. Not so great when they don't want to do it, okay? There is a difference there. But Dad would never take me up and say, this is how you need to post up. No, this is what you need to do. He was just there. Now, if I asked him stuff, he'd teach you how to shoot the free throw, use your legs properly, do this and that, but only when I asked. But here's the even more significant part I didn't realize till I got older. He didn't over-celebrate the good ones. Because everything in me wants to over-celebrate the good ones, which sends a subtle message. That's how you get the biscuits. Right? A lot of us know to give margin. And that doesn't mean you're cold, cold fish, but it just means you watch, because if all you celebrate is the A's, all you celebrate is the performance of something, all you celebrate is when they made the play, not when they didn't make the cut, or they made the major part instead of the small part, all of these things, we're sending a subtle message that somehow they are loved a little bit more. This probably won't surprise you, but I was kind of a punk kid. Again, great home. I was a black sheep. I was all that stuff that when I was a young kid you don't like. When I got older, they go, oh, I made a leader, whatever. How weird is that? But my dad's in education. And so he's going to open houses. And when he go to my brother's, Bob, oh, you're Bob's dad. How cool is that? I want to tell you, Bob is that. Oh, you're Linda's dad. And Dad will tell, if he was here, he'd say, yep, it's true. He'd say, hi, I'm Larry's dad. Oh. But to his credit, all he really asked was, how's he getting along with other kids? And how's he responding to you as an authority? Because he knew that was a lot more important than, they called them threes. They were, you talk too much type of, you know, a 1 was outstanding, a 3 was Larry. Or you didn't finish your homework, or, you know, whatever that would be. And I look back now and I go, that was amazingly brilliant and wise for somebody who's in the whole field. Everybody he's talking to knows what he does, and he's got this kid who's, and all Dad cared about was the thing that would be important at 30. How's he respond to authority, and how is he getting along with the other kids? Some of you have heard me say this phrase, and it sums up all of this. And it's a principle that the fruit is more important than the watering schedule. The fruit on the tree is more important than the watering schedule. And many of us, as we're parents, trying to raise up, I want to raise up a godly adult, I want to raise up someone with character and all that. We start trying to figure out how to do it, and then we start following somebody's watering schedule rather than constantly checking the fruit. And I always tell people, if the fruit is really good and you've got a screwed up watering schedule, keep your screwed up watering schedule. If the fruit is bad, Google watering schedule. and, follow. I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but like Nancy and I, we had a great marriage until we went to the marriage retreat. And pretty much we found out everything we were doing was wrong. Now, in hindsight, I realized the person who was speaking about marriage had jacked up their marriage, and they were really giving us a recipe to how to fix up a really messed up marriage. And I'm sorry, Nancy and I didn't mess ours up. And it was often the same with kids. I'd hear like a good Christian dad is going to do all this stuff. And I'll just confess to you right now. We were supposed to have devotions, right? A little Bible reading and prayer every day. And by the way, if that watering schedule is working for you, great. Or it works for a period of time and then suddenly they're not comfortable with it. Great. But when we tried it, I realized no one wants to have Bible study or devotions with a pastor. Like, what do you think that means? Well, actually, the Greek and Hebrew it didn't work. Once one of them started in some sports that was pretty involved regionally. You're supposed to have dinner a couple times a week? Like, we would, if we did really well, we'd have quesadillas because they're quick about every 8 or 9 days. We took them out of a Christian school in which I was getting a scholarship for them and all that. We put them in a secular school in which it was not, on most standards of schools, the best one because I wanted them to experience life when we were around to help them. And again, I would have changed it immediately if the fruit had suddenly gone bad. But vacations, we live in San Diego. We went on 3 in our life. It's like, why am I going to go on vacation and spend that money? I'm here, right? And yet all the books on parenting, right? Wrong, wrong, wrong. Watch the fruit. I would have changed anything. I would have read all of the recipes if the fruit was bad. But when the fruit is good, I'm not going to use your stinking recipe. Okay? Character over performance. Who they are is far more important than what they do. Number 4, a strong marriage. A strong marriage. I believe the greatest gift you can give a child is a growing mom and dad. That's why long ago, far away in another galaxy at North Coast, we decided to be built around a lecture lab, sermon-based small group model, and why we don't have midweek things for the children all the time. Because I grew up in an environment where we had stuff for the kids all the time. It was awesome. And mom and dad were volunteering in the kids program, but mom and dad were not growing in their own discipleship and their own relationship together. And so we decided long ago the very best gift we could ever give our kids is not a great midweek program, but you guys having a strong marriage and a strong home. Because that is a source of security. A strong marriage is a source of security. Every kid tries to divide and conquer, right? In this room. Don't all your kids do that? Where do they always want to sit? Right between you. When one says no, who do they want to check with? The other one. I mean, they are naturally wired to divide and conquer, but I want to tell you this. They don't want to win that game. They don't want to win that game. My brother, sister, and I are all very comfortable in our own skin, and I put a ton of that on the marriage that mom and dad had. When my friends, buddies, their parents were getting a divorce or whatever, I could hear my parents raise their voice or be annoyed or upset with each other, and I never laid in bed wondering, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Their marriage was so them-centric that on mom and dad's 50th anniversary, they're now on 72, but on their 50th, which back then we thought was like a milestone, we had no idea. But they had a bunch of their friends in our backyard, and because I'm the oldest, I got to go first, and my brother went, and my sister went, and we all said some version of the same thing. My version was this: Mom and Dad, I love how you guys love each other, and I always knew you loved us, but I always knew you loved each other more than us. In fact, I've always felt like if we were out on a lake and there were only 2 life jackets, the 3 of us would go down. And afterward, my mom had tears in her eyes, not happy tears, feeling like, what a crappy mom I am or whatever. And we were all like, no, Mom, that is the greatest thing you ever gave us. Because security comes out of a strong marriage. But when they can divide and conquer, entitlement comes out as the end fruit of it. Make sure you work on your marriage. It's the best gift you can give. There's this totally adult, and I realize sometimes marriage does need to break, okay? I mean, we are in an absolutely fallen world, so I'm speaking now at 30,000 feet of generally, but, you know, totally adult concept is, well, the kids will get over it, so it's just not working out. And any of you from broken homes know the kids don't get over it. It's not how it works. The security and the strength comes from that commitment. Now, practically, here's a couple of things. Do your best. Nobody's going to be perfect, but do your best to always present a unified public front. Even when you disagree, they don't need to know you disagree. My dad, again, was so smart. I said they came from cesspools. Dad came from wealth, a larger family, and just, you read 1 Corinthians chapter 6, do not be deceived, these people will not enter the kingdom of heaven, and that was like everything is kind of my grandpa's listed there. That's, you know. But Mom came from poverty. She was on, it's called workfare, it'd be welfare today. Lived in Montebello. Her mother and her dad came from Missouri. They got a little job. He started drinking too much. He met a redhead, which is why my grandma never liked redheads, even her grandson. But, well, she got over that. But as we were always like, what's with that? Then we found out, oh, okay. So Mom was deserted at 2 years old. I mean, excuse me, a few months old. That's the last time she ever saw her dad. That's it. He came by, I think, once for 10 minutes at some point in her life. That's it. And then in abject poverty. Grandma was what's called a dietitian at the hospital her whole life. You know what that is? That's a person who takes a tray and puts the packaged food on the tray. That's, you know, where they were. So Mom grew up without any boys. Dad grew up with boys. God decided to play a joke on my mom and give her me, and then give her my brother. And boys wrestle, fight, break things, do all the little things boys do. And she couldn't understand it at all. And my dad would come home from work and he would say, Carolyn, it's really okay. They're not going to kill each other. That's what boys do. I was so frustrated with my mom at a period of time when I was a little kid because I felt like she would tell you today, she bought into the control, we need to knock off every little trait that's not compliant, whatever, because she grew up as that compliant savior kid of her grandma. And Dad would come home and go, no, but I never knew that till I was in my 30s. I never knew that. I just thought my dad was as crazy as my mom. And Mom wasn't crazy. Mom just didn't know how to raise boys. She figured it out as time went on. I got a great mom. But here was the beauty. Mom and Dad presented a united front. He didn't let us divide and conquer. Yeah, she was too harsh on that. No, she shouldn't have done this. A united front. Now, I want to get real practical. I've spoken about this. Maybe some of you have heard me do it in a sermon before, or even sometimes on marriage. What do you do when you just flat out can't get to the united front? Right? You desperately want to go right. They desperately want to go left. What do you do? And those things happen sometimes. If you don't do what I'm going to suggest in a moment, what happens is the angry or the stubborn person always wins, which is a great poison in a relationship. Nancy and I learned to use what we call spiritual arbitration. Spiritual arbitration. What is arbitration? Arbitration is where you bring somebody in and they hear both sides and listen. Our spiritual arbitration was this. We're going to decide who is somebody that we think is godly and wise, and we will do whatever they say. So there's no winner or loser between us. That's what we're going to do. Now, we had two of those, and Nancy and I have been fortunate, just kind of by wiring and all that. We're kind of best friends, tend to think alike and all of that, which I realize isn't how every marriage works. But so we didn't have a lot of those strong disagreements. She's also, if she was here, would tell you, though I am verbal, she is the most stubborn person in the world. So that is a great balance because I'm not able to run her over verbally. She just smiles and nods, and she's going to win. So, and most of the time she's right when we're on something small or whatever. But then we had a couple big ones. One had to do with raising our oldest child, that strong-willed one. I did not want him to go through what I went through with some of the tougher times as a result of that. And there was a period of my life where I know culture has shifted, but give me grace and give my dad grace. But there was a period of my life where I was pretty much spanked every day. Not because dad was abusive, but because I deserved it. Okay. Nancy, any of you who know her, sweet, helps, mercy person, she was spanked once in her life by mistake. So now I've got this strong-willed child, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to break his will and not break his spirit. And she's saying, you're too hard on him. I go, you don't understand. He's going to end up in jail, babe. You know, we got to do that. Like, you know, we told him to eat his vegetables, and he defiantly not only said no, but he gave us 4 reasons why not. And 3 of them were good. This is dangerous. Some of you have that kid? So we were not seeing eye to eye, so we said, who are we going to pick? I had a couple people I thought she'd pick, and she said, your folks. And I thought, hallelujah, thank you, Jesus. Because they had to raise me. I slam dunk win this sucker. So we brought mom and dad over, and we talked about kind of what was going on, all that, and they said, Larry, you're too harsh on him. Excuse me. Is there a right of appeal here? Or, you know, can I go to the Supreme Court? No, it was really it was wonderful because at that point, somebody that we respected and had agreed upon, they know better than us, they're wiser than us. So Nancy didn't win, I didn't lose, and I believe to this day that's why I have a great relationship with my oldest son. Because I think I was on a path I didn't see to be that dad that's always pushing that oldest son to be all that he can be and all this kind of stuff. Spiritual arbitration. We did it one other time on a financial issue. There was a deal back then when that was a lot of money, still a lot of money, but way more. There was about $100,000 that we would make slam dunk, it's in our hands, with a transition of houses. Somebody wanted to buy our house, no realtor involved. I'm moving to this other one at about $75,000, $80,000 under market, all that. It's $100,000 right there. Nancy didn't want to do it. I wanted to do it. Arbitration. She's not stupid. She picked my folks. At the end of it, they looked at us and said, Larry's absolutely right. There's a lot of, back when homes were $150,000, there's a lot of money on the table here. But Nancy is absolutely right. As this church is growing like a weed and all the things that are going on, you don't need to be sidetracked with those kind of things going on for the next 6 to 9 months. So don't do it. I've never looked back. Like, oh, something was left on the table that had more zeros on it, and it didn't matter. You with me on that? It's do the united front, and when you can't do the united front, get some help. And counseling's great stuff, but I'm not talking about where you go and dump on everybody and your background, and all that can be helpful. But in this one, just get somebody you trust and decide you're going to do what they say, and then do it. Number 5, respect for authority. Respect for authority. Helicopter parents are killing kids, and now we, of course, have lawnmower parents who don't just hover over, but they clear away every little obstacle in front. And the problem is, if you are raised in a hothouse, you won't survive your first winter. One of the gifts you can give your kids is to respect authority even when it's wrong. It's so counter to our culture. Now, I'm not talking flat out evil wrong, but when it's wrong. Why? Because if you and I raise our kids to think they only follow that which makes sense to them, their walk with God is going to suffer greatly. Because would you agree with me? There are times where God's law, God's call is absolutely clear, and it doesn't seem like it makes much sense, and I'm certain it's not going to work out. And we're raising sometimes a generation that subconsciously is being told that if you do the right thing, everything works out perfectly. And if anybody in any way mistreats you, you've got to go to the wall to make sure it's fixed. And of course, then suddenly they're out in the marketplace, and that's not, look around this room. In the marketplace, is that how it works? There's no principal to go running to, or, whatever it would be. Mom, Dad, fix it. There's going to unfairness. There's all kinds of things that go on. And learning to respect authority is a really big deal. And overreacting to the things that happen to your kids doesn't teach your kids how to do the right thing. It teaches your kids how to be quiet and not tell you. I remember when we put them in the school that I mentioned, about a year and a half later, there were two very inappropriate, in our mind, films that were shown in the classroom to our kids. We sat them down, the ones that had to happen, and said, we think this is inappropriate. Here's why. These are not bad people, but we live differently. And it kind of helped walk them through it. Because if I'd gone, running over to the principal, try to fix it all, that helicopter lawnmower thing, guess what? They would have learned one lesson. When I said, what happened today, don't tell Dad. That's what they would have learned. And so much of life is going to be very unfair. And we have to help our kids get prepared for it when we're around to kind of hold them up. That was even my philosophy with some of my kids. In certain things I let them do or whatever, I wanted to not so protect them that if they fell off the first floor of the roof, they'd break their arm or their leg. We could fix that. I didn't want them falling off the fourth floor of a fraternity party where they're dead. And we literally had some very protected kids that actually went through that exact thing because they'd been so sheltered all along and so make sure everything's okay that when Mom and Dad weren't there, they made some really bad decisions. My freshman year in high school, I was playing with the varsity a little bit, but of course you're coming off the bench as a freshman unless you're really tall, which I wasn't. And so the coach decided, you know what, you're gonna develop more if you go down to what was called the junior varsity and play there. Okay. So I went there, started a couple games, did one game terrible, but another game pretty good. And the third game, suddenly, I didn't play at all the rest of the year. And then the next year, I didn't play at all on that team. When I did get brought up to varsity, the coach said, Larry, I'm really sorry. I thought this would be a good move for your development. It obviously ended up a bad move, et cetera. But here's a part of the story I never knew till decades later. That junior varsity coach, before the third game, found out who my dad was. And he was kind of a wild living kid. Any of you had those kind of coaches, right? They're out on the edge, just like all the kids love them or whatever. He was a wild and crazy guy, and he knew my dad was a Christian. In fact, Dad had led a Bible study at the church where they had both worked together. And that's why I was buried. But I was not going to play in the NBA. I was not going to be some big star. And I learned one of the most important lessons that is to this day, life is not fair. But Jesus is always there. Might as well learn it when it's piddly little stuff like an athletic career than when it's major stuff like a marriage, a professional career, and all kinds of other stuff. But he literally, again, we were grown adults, way past the 30 mark, and, oh yeah, I don't think I ever told you. And it was like, well, bless you for not telling me. Number 6, and of course, curse him for not playing me, but that's another thing. Number 6 is consistency. Consistency. One of the gifts you can give your kid is always being the same person, and especially beware of double standards, where it's okay for you and not for them. Now, I don't mean, well, it's okay for me to drive, but not you, 5-year-old. Or, oh, it's okay for me to have a glass of wine, but not you, 13-year-old. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about true double standards. Because our kids watch. There are no secrets. I hope you know that. You know a lot more about your parents' value systems, strengths, and weaknesses than they think you know. Would you agree? You know a ton more, and so do your kids. And so the idea of a double standard, what we often think is, yeah, but I'm mature. And the problem is, what you see as discretion, they see as hypocrisy. And every kid wants to grow up faster, not slower. So I'll watch like single parents in their dating patterns follow a pattern that they don't want their son or daughter to follow with their, high school boyfriend or girlfriend. I go, well, are you kidding me? Consistency is one of the most, because they can figure out what's going on. By the way, any of you had a drunk dad or mom? You know what that was like. Because the stereotypical drunk dad or mom, you never knew which one you're going to get. The angry one, the happy one, the whatever. And consistency is so important. It was a big deal for Nancy and I when, again, this is description, not prescription, but when we came here, she's from a Middle Eastern culture, so wine's a part of it and all of that. And we had to decide, because back then, in 1920, when I came, no, it wasn't that long ago. But when I came, there was this idea, can like a Christian drink, good wine, and a pastor, are you really kidding me, or whatever. So I had lots of friends. They had two standards. They had one standard when they were on vacation and another standard when they're at home. And I thought, my kids will not see that as being wise and discretionary. They'll see that as being hypocritical. Besides that, I'm always going to ask, where am I? Instead, I'm always just the same. And then when our church got stinking big like it is, I couldn't go anywhere anyway without somebody saying, hi, Pastor Larry. And of course, they never say that on front end. If it's a waiter or waitress, they do that at the end so they can find out I'm really a jerk or a nice guy or whatever. Like, tell me quickly, and then I'll put on my good hat. The student is not above his teacher, but everyone who's fully trained will be like his teacher. I've already said it. They adopt our values, but not our boundaries. So live what you want them to live. And whatever's right is right, whatever's wrong is wrong. In our case, we decided, you know what? We're going to have some people in this community who are upset because they see me at an Italian restaurant or whatever, and I've got a nice Chianti or whatever it'd be. Like, great, there's lots of other good churches. But we were going to be one thing or the other. And it's okay to be the other. But just be consistent. Number 7. Got 3 more. And then I want to be able to take some questions from you guys as well. So number 7 is financial wisdom and restraint. Financial wisdom and restraint. If you had parents who didn't teach you anything about finances, well, get some Finances for Dummies or Google some, one of the, from TED Talks to Khan Academy. Learn something about that because it's a very important part of life. But it's not just financial wisdom, which will help a ton for them. It is so sad how many kids in their 30s, 40s, and 50s have to support parents who were foolish with finances. You don't want to do that to your kids. But the other is restraint. And here's what happens. Beware of financial pretending. What is financial pretending? When I act like I have more than I have. Proverbs talks about there's a man who appears to have everything, but you open up his cupboards, they are bare. And there's a man who appears to have nothing. I guess we call it stealth wealth today. And you open up those cupboards and they're full of everything. There's pretending that we fall into. And here's some of them we do. Kind of the 4 horsemen of financial failure and financial bad example. Christmas. We spend money we don't have so our kids have a great Christmas. Ever thought that one? Okay. I mean, I'm sure some of us have been there. Hey, man, it's been I want my kid to have a great Christmas so they can have a crappy rest of the year. I mean, help me understand that. When you spend money you don't have to give a great Christmas memory, you are pretending. And you know what? It's not all that bad to grow up poor, because you can grow up hungry, in a good sense of hungry. Whereas when you're in a pretending world, well, I go back to what I talked about earlier, you end up entitled. You think, well, whatever I want, I'm supposed to get, because mom and dad did that. I see over and over and over, for the sake of a good Christmas, people have a really bad year. It doesn't make any sense. The second one is schooling. People spend money they don't have to send their kid to a school they can't afford, and then they're just teaching a lesson. If you really want it, you got to get it. The fact is, the Lord will be with us wherever it is we have to go and whatever we have to go through. My mom, who as a young kid thought of herself as like, I'm living the worst life ever. No male figures around me was a big deal for her, and trying to figure out her identity, the poverty, the being laughed at by some of the kids in school and all that. But I want to tell you, by the time she was 35, pretty much all of her friends who laughed at her wanted to be her. Because this is just a little passing section right now, especially college. You know, I made too much money for, we were in that middle zone where if you don't make much money, colleges give you a bunch of scholarships. And, we made too much for that. But I remember sitting down with my kids and saying, I know all your friends are going to this and that college or whatever, but I don't have $500,000 or $600,000 to give all three of you a 4-year college experience. And if I do, you're going to be taking care of me in my old age, and I'm moving in, you know. It's like, we're not going to pretend. We're not going to pretend. And because we didn't pretend, by the time they were early 30s, all of them owned a house in this area. Why? I'm not going to let you borrow money just because somebody will let us borrow money. We're going to live within our means. We're going to trust God. And again, please, I'm trying to help you think about things. That's why I keep saying this over and over. I am not the Holy Spirit. I'm not the Bible. There might be very good reasons for you to do something different, and you wouldn't have to apologize if we're talking about it. But I'm challenging you to think about things that most of the people in the world don't think about. The third one is weddings, although there's starting to be a backlash in the last 5-10 years, you know, against spending money on weddings that, like, you don't have that money. My basic rule of thumb is if I got to borrow to do it, I ain't doing it. That's like, we're going to teach our kids something else. And the fourth one was that club program. I was talking to somebody recently, it was $50,000 a kid because they were moving up at very high levels. One of them was actually Junior Olympics and probably still won't play in the Olympics or whatever, but it's like, guys, you don't have that money. But, oh, we can borrow it, we can do this, and we can do that. Financial responsibility. The best life lesson is reality, not an image. The best life lesson is reality, not an image. In fact, little sidebar, I mentioned before that Nancy and I had a financial meltdown. In 08, 09, there were a group of us that were building. I had done really well with some investments and some stuff, and always from really young age lived below our means, and a group of us were building a bunch of homes. When the market turned, we were not highly leveraged when we were building those homes. We had all these exit strategies that were there because we knew Disneyland was about to end. And so we turned in our plans, which added millions of dollars to the value of it. The city planners in that particular city said, we love it, but you have to do a CEQA, a California environmental study. We go, no, we already did. We wouldn't have bought unentitled land. Do we look crazy? And then here was the answer. I'm sorry, we made a mistake. You can't sue a municipality for that. And we all knew, like, uh-oh, we think in 3 to 6 months Disneyland is over. And our exit strategy, it was a few $100,000, but it was 6 months to 18 months. So we're dead. So sure enough, boom. All that had been saved for those particular investments was gone. We sat our kids down who were in high school. I think Yeah, somewhere. And we sat down, we told them exactly what happened. See, you're afraid of doing that. That's the best gift I ever gave my kids financially. Let us tell you what we did, why we did it. No, knowing what I know, I'd still do it again if I didn't know the outcome. Bad things happen even when you do everything right. God is just as good when there's lots of zeros as when all those zeros are gone and there's only a zero. And we're not going to be eating out like we used to. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. See, a lot of you are afraid to do that. Dad just lost his job. Mom just got demoted at work or whatever. Those are the best lessons you can give your kids. Not, it's going to be really tight the next 2 years, so let's pretend it's Christmas. You with me on that? Okay. Reality is a great teacher. Number 8 is natural consequences. Letting your kids see the natural consequences of their behavior. I've already talked about helicopter parents overprotect and enabling parents remove painful consequences. It doesn't do any good to overprotect on the front end, and it doesn't do any good to put a pan in the pants when God's given them a SWAT on the rear, because they won't learn the lesson. And that's what enabling parents do. I had an uncle of mine, I remember, telling me that how important family is. And he said, if my son, if he gets arrested, man, I would get him out of jail like instantly, and I'd lie or I'd do whatever I had to. I forget what created the conversation. Well, the irony is at 27, he was killed in an accident tied to his drugs and all the things he'd been enabled and rescued from over and over and over again. If you rescue kids from the consequences, they simply learn that nothing is as bad as people tell you it will be. And so they just keep pushing the envelope. By the way, that's why you never want to discipline your kids in anger and say things, you're grounded for 5 years or whatever it is. In fact, you should never discipline in anger. You should wait until you're both in a good mood, then nail them. No. What I mean is that expressive anger, like I had some friends, and I bet you did too, they knew that if we stayed out just a couple more hours and did this or that, dad or mom would scream and yell at them and ground them for like the next 4 months, but we knew it would only last 2 weeks. They taught us that. So it's no wonder some of these guys ended that with law and in jail and all kinds of other things, because they were taught from the beginning, you know what? Something really bad is going to happen, but don't worry, I'm going to always come to the rescue. It doesn't work that way. Prodigal son. You know the story of the prodigal son in the Bible? Sometimes people say, and that father, so the prodigal son takes his half of the inheritance and he goes off and he squanders it, and wild living, prostitutes, all kinds of stuff. And then, excuse me, I'm sorry about that. He finally comes to his senses when he's eaten pig food as a Jew. So he comes back. The father sees him and runs to him and embraces him. And I had people early on telling me, yeah, the father every day was out there looking, just looking. Is he going to come back? It's not what he was doing. The father was just working. And he saw his son out there and recognized the gate and said, holy moly, that's Larry. And went running to him. And then the good brother, if you know that story, is all upset because they throw this party for the prodigal son brother. And the dad looks at the good brother and says, what are you worried about? Well, you never threw a party for me. Yeah, but everything I have is yours. I'm not going to replace the inheritance. Your brother was dead, written off. I'd moved on. When by the grace of God he shows up, I'm going to give him a hug, I'm going to give him a robe, give him a job in the house, give him a nice little ring, but everything I have is still yours. A lot of families don't understand those natural consequences, and you can have a wild child that all the other kids grow up suffering. Some of you were that suffering kid in your own family with a brother or a sister that was like getting all the attention and all of this because somebody was rescuing. Natural consequences. Number 9. Quantity time. Because quality time is a myth. You ever heard that one? Oh, we have quality time. No, quality just shows up in the midst of quantity. One of the most important things you can learn for your marriage and for your kids is you have to have quantity to get to quality. You know, my kids, I can never say, well, are you gonna get a home run this game? Are you gonna score a bunch of points? Because I kind of need to know whether I should go to this one or the next one, or it just happens. My daughter is a very quiet person. And so I would pick her up because of my job, you know, I could adjust hours or whatever. So when she was running cross country, I pretty much picked her up every day after practice. And here was a routine. Hey, Rach, how did day go? Okay. Anything happen? Not really. How'd practice go? Okay. So have you been there? It's like, what is this? But I wasn't going to give up quantity, because every now and then, how was the day? It all exploded. And I've got such a great relationship with my daughter today, and I'm sure a lot of it was just driving quietly, not making her say more than she wanted to say, as she's trying to figure out those high school and the hormones and all the stuff that's going on in her life, just being there. And then when it would all pour out, I'm there. I'm not getting it from mom. I'm not getting it secondhand. It takes quantity to have quality. And quality is an adult myth that we come up with so we don't have to be bothered. And then the last one, and then I'll take some questions. The last one is find a way to enter into their world. Enter into their world. In the Bible, it's called the incarnation. Jesus became one of us. Incarnational parenting means we don't wait for them to come to us. We go into their world. As they get older, figure out their music. You know, and I know what you're going to say. You're going to say the same thing my parents did, same thing I thought and all this. Like, oh, this is really crass and all that stuff. And all I got to do is listen to music I grew up in. It was just as lame. We knew exactly what that song was about. And, you know, I mean, and the point is, you don't want to be the person that tells them the world they're in is a bad world and the world you were in is a good world, because they'll shut you out of it. Yeah, Jesus came to Rome. He was grew up in stinking Nazareth, born in tiny little Bethlehem where like nothing good can come out of Galilee. He entered the world. And one of the best things you can do is enter the world. My dad was amazing at this. I already talked about it, and I'll close with this one. Him going to my games, and I said about my brother. So my brother is, well, he's retired now, but was a cop. I think he was number 4 on the food chain in the 3rd largest department in the world. So he grew up to very high-ranking things, very significant stuff, even nationally with other departments, because the department he was in and some of the terrorist type and weapon type stuff that he was involved in. Bob was a big deal. All kinds of awards. And like a lot of cops, I don't know what it is, but there's something about the rule book they like. They're always great storytellers, and they like to be umpires and referees. I have no idea, but there's an awful lot, you know, in the NFL, whatever. And so Bob, who never played sports very much, because he was always, I was a long-haired hippie, and he had white walls and was studying. I come home, and he's reading how to set up police roadblocks. Like, I got my ponytail. I'm thinking, dude, you'll never get a girlfriend. He's thinking, you'll never get out of jail. But that was, we ended up both doing okay. But he decides, yeah. And so he, like anything he did, he pours himself into it. But he started as a referee in a freshman football game. Okay? You don't start out, he ended up doing college and all kinds of, but you don't start out there. You start out on the lowest of the low, where the kids don't even know what, you know, their helmet's supposed to aim this way, not that way. I mean, just really, right? And there he is. And there would be my dad, quietly watching, people coming up to him and saying, oh, or one of those kids, your grandson? And no, he'd go, no, that's my son, the line judge. At a freshman game, made up of kids who didn't know how to walk and chew gum, much less throw a football and catch it. But that's why there's such a deep love with all three of us. And that's why that distance that some of you felt with your parents or you're seeing other things isn't there with them, because they entered our world. We didn't know how to enter their world. They knew how to enter our world. And I'm thinking, you've been at all these special award things and all this stuff he's done, and you're sitting there driving 35 minutes. Now he's retired at that point, so he can do it. You're driving 35 minutes to watch him be a line judge with a bunch of 14-year-olds. That's entering the world. And these are the gifts that we can give that make a huge difference. So anyway, that's all I know. So my hope is that I've challenged some of the paradigms and worldviews to give you some stuff to think about. And that maybe for almost all of us, there's one or two things that's kind of a take-home thing with what we've done.